It was a moment that would change everything. The kind of moment that no one ever expects, but deep down everyone knows could arrive at any time. The Braxton family, a picture of wealth and privilege, gathered in the grand living room of their late patriarch's mansion, their faces a mixture of eager anticipation and quiet anxiety. The thick curtains were drawn back, letting in the faint afternoon sunlight that lit up the ornate furnishings, gilded frames, crystal chandeliers, and expensive rugs that barely touched the floor. The room was silent except for the faint rustle of papers as the heir, a tall man in his late 50s with a stern expression, adjusted his glasses and shuffled through the documents in his hands. It was his job to read the will, but he knew this was no ordinary occasion. The Braxton family had been waiting for this moment for weeks. Ever since the passing of Mr. Braxton, for years, they had lived under the shadow of his influence and control. And now it was time for his final decision. The family members, who once hung on every word of their father's commands, now sat nervously as his will would be the last instruction they'd receive from him. As they all anxiously awaited the reading, there was a sense of certainty in the air, a certainty that the fortune that had defined their lives would soon be theirs. In their minds, the next few moments would solidify their place in the world of wealth and status they had always known. Their plans were already made. Sarah, the eldest daughter, envisioned herself expanding her fashion business with a lavish new studio. Thomas, the son, already had his eyes on a new sports car, something sleek and fast to mark his success. And Patricia, the wife, was already dreaming of the world travels she would take with the money. Each family member had a vision of their new life, and it was a life filled with luxury. The reading of the will wasn't just a formality. It was the final step in securing their future. As the heir began speaking, his voice was calm, methodical, but it carried an undercurrent of tension that all could feel. "We are gathered here today," he began, "to honor the final wishes of Mr. Braxton, a man who has left behind a legacy that none of us will forget. I will now read his will as he requested, and as his family, you will hear the distribution of his estate." His words were polite, but the weight of them seemed to settle heavily in the room, thickening the air. Sarah's fingers twitched nervously as she glanced at her brother Thomas, who was sitting beside her. His eyes were fixed on the heir, and she could see the faintest grin playing at the corners of his mouth. Both of them were already imagining the size of their new bank accounts. Patricia sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap. She was calm on the outside, but in truth her nerves were running wild. She had always been the dutiful wife, but in this room, her role as the matriarch was about to be confirmed, or so she thought. The lawyer took a deep breath, adjusted his papers again, and began to read aloud the first part of the will. "I, Richard Braxton, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare the following." His words were formal, but each one held significance. Sarah's heart skipped a beat when she heard her name, and Thomas's expression shifted slightly, his brow furrowing. "I hereby bequeath 20% of my estate to my eldest daughter, Sarah, 30% to my son, Thomas, and 50% to my beloved wife, Patricia, for her care and well-being." For a moment there was a silence. It wasn't the silence of shock, but the silence of complete certainty. Their faces lit up with smiles as they exchanged glances, knowing they were about to get exactly what they had expected. The numbers, the percentage, were almost too perfect. Sarah, who had always thought of herself as the star of the family, was going to inherit a fifth of the estate to help expand her business. Thomas, the charming and quick-witted son, had more than enough to satisfy his love for fast cars and luxury. And Patricia, ever the loyal wife, would have more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. Everything was falling into place exactly as they had imagined. Their years of waiting, of pretending to be the dutiful children and wife, had paid off. This was their reward, their moment to shine. They could already taste the success. Sarah could already see herself purchasing a penthouse apartment, throwing parties in the grand ballroom of her new mansion, while Thomas was mentally choosing between a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, thinking of all the places he'd take it for a joyride. Patricia, on the other hand, was planning where she would go on her endless vacations, perhaps, A beach house in the Caribbean or a private villa in the Swiss Alps? The family, now filled with smug satisfaction, couldn't imagine that anything would be different from what they had anticipated. Their smiles were wide, their hands were twitching, ready to start counting the money, making arrangements. This was their moment, or so they thought. But the layer wasn't done. He adjusted his glasses again and glanced up at the family, whose faces were still beaming with satisfaction. And now, he continued, his voice steady but carrying a sense of finality, there is one more part to be read. The room froze. The family members exchanged nervous glances, their smiles faltering ever so slightly. What else could there be? What more could Mr. Braxton have left to say? The will was already clear, wasn't it? There was nothing else to add. But the lawyer continued, his tone unwavering. I, Richard Braxton, also wish to make the following provision. And with that, the words that followed would be the ones that would wipe away every ounce of satisfaction from the faces of the Braxton family. It was a line that would shatter their certainty, break apart their plans, and forever alter their relationships with each other. The lawyer paused for a moment, and the room seemed to hold its breath. In that instant, the tension was palpable. Nothing would be the same again. Hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning in to this story. My goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I truly believe Fractured Promises can be a place where you find inspiration and motivation. If you're enjoying these real, engaging stories, it would mean the world if you could hit that subscribe button. By subscribing, you'll be the first to hear more powerful stories that will inspire you, challenge you, and keep you coming back for more. I'm committed to bringing you the best real-life stories with lessons we can all learn from, so stick with me on this journey. Subscribe now, and let's grow together. Stay tuned for more. The lawyer, his glasses slightly askew as he prepared to continue, paused, creating an almost unbearable silence in the room. The Braxton family, still basking in the joy of hearing their expected portions from the will, shifted in their seats. The satisfaction that had initially flooded them now began to waver, uncertainty creeping into their minds. The moments that followed felt like an eternity as the lawyer's voice broke the silence, but this time there was a shift. I, Richard Braxton, the lawyer began, his voice more measured than before, also wish to make the following provision. The family members froze, and for the first time in years, there was a collective unease in the room. Sarah, the eldest daughter, felt her stomach tighten. Her mind raced through possible scenarios, but none could have prepared her for what would follow. What else could there possibly be? The will had already been clear, hadn't it? Sarah quickly glanced at her brother Thomas, who sat with his lips tightly pressed, his face now devoid of the smugness that had earlier adorned it. Patricia, the wife, clasped her hands in front of her, her fingers beginning to turn white from the pressure. She had remained composed through the entire reading, but now she could feel her pulse quicken. The lawyer continued reading, each word heavier than the last, hanging in the air like a thunderstorm waiting to break. I hereby declare that my estate shall be inherited by my long-lost daughter Claire, whom I disowned years ago. The words cut through the family like a sharp blade, and the room seemed to spin in that instant. Claire? The name barely registered in their minds as they all looked at each other, bewilderment and confusion flashing across their faces. Sarah's mind immediately raced back to the time when Claire was still part of the family. She had been the black sheep, the one who rebelled, the one whose actions had caused so much tension that her father had eventually severed ties with her. Claire, disowned and forgotten, had disappeared from their lives years ago, and no one had thought about her since. But now, her name, her very existence, was being resurrected in the most unexpected of ways. Sarah's eyes widened as the weight of the lawyer's words settled in. How could this be? How could Mr. Braxton, a man known for his precision and control, leave his entire estate to someone he had publicly discarded? It didn't make sense. Her mind raced with questions, and the reality that they were all about to lose everything began to settle in. Her gaze shifted to Thomas, whose face had gone pale, his lips trembling as he tried to process what he had just heard. This can't be real, he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. Patricia, too, was struggling to maintain her composure. For years, she had stood by her husband's side, playing the perfect wife, supporting him through every decision, and now, it seemed that all of that loyalty and devotion had meant nothing. A daughter who had been cast aside, forgotten, had now become the sole inheritor of everything they had spent their lives building. Patricia clenched her jaw, trying to remain calm, but the anger rising within her was undeniable. "This doesn't make sense," she finally managed to say, her voice shaking with frustration. "Why her? Why Claire?" The lawyer continued, as if unaware of the shockwave his words had caused. He spoke of the legal formalities and the instructions that Mr. Braxton had left, all in place for Claire to inherit the house, the businesses, the wealth, everything. He explained that Claire would now become the new head of the Braxton estate, and that all of Mr. Braxton's possessions, every single asset, would be transferred to her. The lawyer's voice was like a distant hum as Sarah, Thomas, and Patricia were consumed with their thoughts, trying to comprehend what was happening. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating, as each family member turned inward, reflecting on the past, the years of their father's control, and the devastation of what had just been revealed. They couldn't understand how Claire, the rebellious daughter who had left their lives, could suddenly become the beneficiary of everything. Sarah's thoughts were a blur of anger and confusion. She had worked so hard, built her career from the ground up, and had been preparing to take her business to new heights with the money from her inheritance. All of that, all of her plans, seemed to be slipping away in that moment. She had always been the good daughter, the one who had stayed close to their father, who had supported him, never once questioning his authority. And now she was being told that her entire future would be built on a fraction of what she had expected. Thomas, too, was in shock, his mind struggling to process the reality that the lavish lifestyle he had imagined for himself, his cars, his house, his endless luxuries, was slipping through his fingers. He had always been the charming son, the one who could talk his way into anything, but he had never anticipated this. His life had always been easy, always about enjoying the fruits of someone else's labor, and now, it seemed that all of that was about to come to a screeching halt. Patricia, her face flushed with disbelief, struggled to keep her emotions in check. Her entire life had been about maintaining the family's image, making sure everything was perfect, supporting her husband in every way, and now it all seemed meaningless. The woman they had cast out, the one they had dismissed, was about to inherit it all. I can't believe this," Patricia whispered under her breath, her voice barely audible. "How could he do this? After all we've done for him, for this family, he leaves everything to her." The family's world had turned upside down in an instant. The lawyer continued with the details, but no one was truly listening anymore. The shock had overwhelmed them, drowning out everything else. They had gone from expecting to celebrate their newfound wealth to facing an uncertain future. As the lawyer wrapped up the details of the will, each family member was left with their own feelings of betrayal, anger, and disbelief. What would they do now? How would they recover from this? Claire, the one they had all written off, was the one who had been given everything. The future they had envisioned was gone, replaced by a reality they could never have prepared for. The lawyer finished his reading, but it was as if the room was still echoing with the sound of his last words. Claire, the name hung in the air. A ghost that had haunted them for years, now resurrected to claim what was rightfully theirs. The Braxtons, once so sure of their place in the world, now had nothing but questions and uncertainty, and they had no idea how to begin to deal with what had just been thrust upon them. The shock that had settled over the room in the aftermath of the lawyer's revelation slowly began to give way to something much darker: anger. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and what had started as disbelief now morphed into a boiling rage. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice shaking with frustration as she stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. "This is absurd," she snapped, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "How could he do this to us, to me?" Her words rang out in the tense silence that had settled after the lawyer's reading. She had always believed herself to be her father's favorite, the daughter who had worked hardest to live up to his expectations. She had poured her soul into her fashion business, and she had sacrificed everything for her family's approval. Yet here she was, standing in the wake of her father's death, left with nothing but a fraction of what she had thought would be hers. The entire vision she had built for herself, a vision that relied on her inheritance, was crumbling before her eyes. It felt like a slap in the face, a betrayal not just of her, but of everything she had ever known about her place in the family. She turned to her brother Thomas, who had been sitting silently for the past few moments, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Thomas, say something," she demanded. Her voice cracked with emotion as she looked at him, almost pleading for him to say something that would restore some semblance of order to the chaos. But Thomas, still stunned, merely stared at her. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. He couldn't even bring himself to process what had just been said, let alone address it. The man who had always been the life of the party, the one with a quick joke and a charming smile, now looked lost. The anger he felt was masked by his own disbelief. Thomas had always been the carefree one, the one who didn't worry about the future because he knew his place in the family was secure. Money, cars, and a lifestyle of luxury had always been within arm's reach. But now, with this shocking revelation about Claire's inheritance, everything was suddenly in jeopardy. He had always taken his wealth for granted, but now he realized just how easily it could all be taken away from him. Patricia, too, had been silent for the past few moments, but the anger that bubbled inside her was quickly becoming too much to bear. She had spent years building a life with Richard, supporting him, following his lead, never questioning his decisions. She had always been the perfect wife, the one who stayed behind the scenes, the one who kept the family together. She had been the one to comfort him, to provide him with stability while the others went on with their lives. And now, after everything she had given to him, after all the years of loyalty, she was being told that Claire, who had been disowned, who had walked away from the family years ago, was to inherit everything. It was as if the life they had built together meant nothing. The weight of this betrayal crushed her, and the anger she felt was unlike anything she had ever experienced. She stood up from her chair slowly, her movements deliberate as she turned toward the lawyer, her face hardening into a mask of fury. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice tight with rage. How could he leave everything to her? After everything we've done, after everything I've done, he leaves it all to a daughter he disowned? She couldn't even look at Sarah or Thomas. They were both too wrapped up in their own confusion and anger to see the devastation that was slowly eating away at her. They didn't understand what she had sacrificed. They hadn't seen the late nights, the compromises, the years of taking a back seat to her husband's demands, all for the sake of keeping the family intact. And now, after all that, she was left with nothing. It was as though everything she had worked for was meaningless. Her life's purpose, her reason for enduring years of hardship, had amounted to nothing in Richard's eyes. "This isn't right," Patricia continued, her voice rising. "He was supposed to take care of us. We were his family. I was his wife. And yet he leaves it all to someone he kicked out of the family years ago?" The disbelief in her words was evident. The anger coursing through her veins was palpable, and she struggled to contain it. She had spent her life following the rules, doing what was expected of her, and now it felt as if all of it had been for nothing. Sarah, hearing her mother's words, felt a jolt of rage surge through her. She had always considered herself to be the one who had earned her place in the family. She had worked tirelessly, building a career from scratch, putting in long hours, making sacrifices. And yet, here was Claire, a name that hadn't been spoken in years, being handed everything she had worked so hard for. Sarah could feel the heat rise in her chest. The injustice of it all overwhelmed her, and she couldn't hold back her anger any longer. "This is unbelievable," Sarah cried out, her voice trembling with emotion. "How could he do this to us? After everything we've done for him? After everything we've sacrificed for this family, he gives it all to her?" The words seemed to echo through the room, and the anger that had been bubbling beneath the surface erupted. She stormed toward the lawyer, her eyes blazing with fury. This isn't what we agreed on. This isn't what he promised. She couldn't understand why her father had done this, why he had turned his back on the family that had always supported him. The thought that Claire, the one who had left them, was now going to inherit everything was too much to bear. It was as though their entire lives had been a lie. The air in the room was thick with tension, and as the lawyer sat quietly, his expression unreadable, the family's emotions continued to simmer. Each member of the Braxton family had their own version of the truth, their own perception of what they deserved, and the realization that they were no longer in control of their fate was a hard pill to swallow. The lawyer's words, once so clear, now felt like a distant hum. No one was listening anymore. The only thing that mattered now was the anger, the feeling of betrayal, and the loss of everything they had expected to inherit. Sarah, Thomas, and Patricia were consumed by their emotions, each one struggling to make sense of the reality they were now facing. As they all stood in the room, the anger building between them, one thing was clear: their world had been shattered, and they had no idea how to rebuild it. The will, the final decision of a man they thought they knew, had torn them apart, and there was no going back. The room was thick with silence as the Braxton family struggled to come to terms with what had just been revealed. The lawyer's words still echoed in their ears: "Claire, the long-lost daughter, shall inherit everything." For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. It felt as if time had stopped, leaving the family suspended in disbelief. The once lively and confident family, who had prided themselves on their unity, now stood scattered and fractured by a single unexpected announcement. Sarah was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and confusion. "This doesn't make sense. How could he leave everything to her? After everything we've done for him, after everything we've built together?" Sarah's face flushed with anger, her eyes narrowed as she turned to look at her brother Thomas for support. But Thomas, usually the one to have the last word, was silent. His face was pale, his jaw clenched tightly, as though he was trying to process the impossible truth in front of him. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of how Claire, the daughter who had once been rejected and disowned, could now become the sole beneficiary of the family's fortune. The thought was almost laughable, except it wasn't. Patricia, too, stood frozen, her hands gripping the back of the chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had been the one to stay behind the scenes for years, supporting Richard through every trial, every decision, and now, the very men she had spent her life loving and supporting had turned on her. The betrayal stung more than anything she could have imagined. She had given him everything: her time, her loyalty, her love, and now she was being cast aside in favor of a daughter who hadn't even been part of their lives for years. The anger inside her was a slow burn that threatened to consume her, but she couldn't even find the words to express it. "This isn't fair," Patricia finally muttered, almost to herself. "After all these years, after all the sacrifices, he leaves everything to her." Sarah's head snapped toward her mother, the rage in her eyes burning brighter. "You don't get it, Mom," she spat, her voice rising. "It's not just about the money. It's about everything we've been promised, everything we've worked for. How could he do this to us? How could he do this to you?" She pointed at her mother as though placing the blame squarely on Patricia's shoulders. Patricia, stunned by the accusation, opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Sarah, feeling the weight of her own frustration, turned away, her fists clenched at her sides. "We've all spent our lives living in his shadow," Sarah continued, her voice shaking with emotion. "But I've worked for everything I have. I've given up everything for this family, and now it's all gone." Thomas finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it doesn't make sense. How could he leave everything to Claire? Why her? What about us? What about all of us?" His words were laced with disbelief, and his hands shook slightly as he tried to grasp the full weight of what had just been revealed. Patricia shot him a look of disbelief, her eyes narrowing as she glared at him. "What about us?" she repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. "We've spent our entire lives being loyal to him, and she gets everything. She wasn't even here when he needed her. There was a long pause, and for a moment it felt as if the whole world had gone still. No one knew how to react, how to process what had just been thrown at them. The very foundation of their lives had been shaken, and in its place was an emptiness that none of them knew how to fill. Claire's name loomed over them like a shadow, a specter that had haunted their family for years, but one they had thought was gone for good. They had all moved on without her, convinced that her departure from the family had been final. But now the unthinkable had happened. She was back. And she was taking everything they had ever wanted. The lawyer, who had been sitting in the corner quietly watching the family unravel, cleared his throat again, his presence a reminder that this was all legal and final. He didn't need to say anything. His mere existence in the room was enough to remind them that there was nothing they could do to change the situation. "Is that it?" Sarah snapped, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "That's all we get? A few sentences that change our entire lives? Just like that?" The lawyer remained silent, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He had done his job. The will had been read, and it was now up to the Braxtons to figure out how they would move forward. But that was the last thing on anyone's mind. No one knew how to move forward when everything they had worked for, everything they thought they had earned, was suddenly ripped away from them. "We need to talk to her," Patricia finally said, her voice quiet but firm. Her eyes, once filled with fury, were now tinged with something else, a deep, bitter resolve. "We need to find Claire. We need to understand why he did this. We need answers." Thomas blinked in confusion, shaking his head. "You really think she's going to talk to us?" he asked, his tone harsh. "After everything that's happened? She's been gone for years. She doesn't owe us anything." Patricia didn't respond at first. She simply stood there, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her mind working furiously to figure out what had gone wrong. She had always thought that she understood her husband, that she knew what motivated him, what he wanted. But now she realized that she had been wrong. There had been something beneath the surface that none of them had seen, and that something had now destroyed their lives. "Maybe we don't deserve to understand," Sarah said bitterly, her voice low and filled with self-loathing. "Maybe we're not entitled to an explanation, but I need to know why. I can't let this go." "None of us can," Patricia replied quietly. "But if we want answers, we need to find Claire." The words hung in the air, a declaration of war against a past that none of them had ever truly understood. They had been living in their father's shadow for so long, obeying his every command, following his every lead. And now, in the wake of his death, they had to confront the reality that the person they had thought was the outsider, the one who didn't belong, was now the one who had been chosen. The room, once filled with the lightness of their imagined futures, now felt cold, empty, and oppressive. The family was no longer united. They were a group of individuals, each of them fighting for their own survival in a world that had shifted beneath their feet. And the only thing that was clear was that they all had one goal in mind: to find Claire and to understand why the man they had all loved had made the decision he did. The Braxtons were no longer a family. They were fractured, each one torn between anger, betrayal, and the deep, gnawing fear of what came next. And the only person who could explain it all was the one who had been cast aside, the one who now stood to inherit everything. The Braxton family stood at the precipice of something they couldn't quite grasp, the weight of Mr. Braxton's final decision pressing down on them like an insurmountable burden. The anger that had surged through them in the wake of the lawyer's revelation now settled into a deep, aching frustration. The grand house that had once been filled with the sounds of laughter, discussions about business, and the occasional family argument now felt cold, alien, and suffocating. It was as though the walls themselves had absorbed the tension, reflecting back at them their confusion and helplessness. Patricia, once the unwavering matriarch of the household, was no longer the center of the family. She had always prided herself on being the one to hold things together, to ensure that no matter what happened, the family would always find a way to persevere. But now, Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed felt like it had been swept away in a single moment. The thought of Claire, the daughter who had been discarded and forgotten, inheriting the entire estate was more than just a betrayal. It felt like the ultimate insult. For years, Patricia had put her own dreams on hold, always putting her family first. She had supported Richard's every decision, stood by his side through thick and thin, and yet now she was left with nothing. Her hands trembled as she paced back and forth in the drawing room, her mind reeling with thoughts of how things had gone so wrong. "I can't do this," she muttered to herself, though her voice cracked. "I can't just sit here and let her take everything." She stopped and turned to Sarah, who had been staring blankly out the window, her mind no doubt filled with the same questions. "We have to do something. We have to find Claire. We need to understand why he left her everything. Why would he do this?" Sarah's gaze shifted toward her mother, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion, anger, and helplessness. The weight of their shared frustration seemed to settle between them, an unspoken understanding passing through the room. Sarah had always considered herself the more ambitious one, the one who worked hard to carve out her own identity. She had built her fashion business from the ground up, had fought for every bit of success she had achieved, and now it all seemed meaningless. The will had taken away her dreams in the blink of an eye. "I don't know," Sarah replied quietly, her voice tinged with defeat. "But we can't just sit here. We need answers. We need to know what happened. Why did he change his mind? Why was Claire the one he chose?" Thomas, who had been silent for the most part, finally spoke, his voice strained with frustration. "She doesn't owe us anything. Why would she even care? We didn't exactly leave her with a warm welcome when she was disowned. What makes us think she's going to just waltz in here and explain herself?" His words stung, but they were grounded in a harsh reality that none of them wanted to acknowledge. Claire had been cast out of the family years ago. She had left on her own terms, angry and hurt by her father's decisions, and now, the very thing they had all hoped for, riches, power, security, was being handed to someone they barely knew anymore. Sarah shot Thomas an angry glance. "You don't get it, do you?" she snapped. "It's not just about the money. It's about why she was chosen. What made her so special in his eyes? Why would he betray us like this after everything we've done for him?" Patricia nodded, her face tightening with resolve. "We need to find her," she said firmly. "We need to know why. We can't just let this go." And so, despite the hurt, despite the anger, the Braxtons found themselves united in one goal: to find Claire, to seek the answers they desperately needed, to confront the woman who had been handed everything they had worked for. The search for Claire began almost immediately. The family, driven by a sense of entitlement and bitterness, set off to track down the woman they hadn't seen in years. But the search was not as easy as they had anticipated. Claire had vanished after her disownment, leaving no trace of where she had gone. The years of silence between her and the family had built walls that no one knew how to tear down. They combed through old addresses, contacted mutual acquaintances, and even hired private investigators to track her down. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of Claire. It was as if she had disappeared from the face of the earth. The tension within the family grew as the search dragged on. Every phone call, every lead that went cold, only deepened their frustration. Patricia, who had once been so sure of her place in the family, now found herself at the mercy of the uncertainty that hung over them. The more time that passed, the more she began to question everything. Had Richard truly wanted Claire to take over, or was there something more behind his decision? What had Claire done to earn his favor when the rest of them had devoted their lives to him? It was a question that gnawed at her, keeping her up at night. Sarah, too, was consumed by doubt. Her mind kept returning to the one thing she couldn't understand. Why Claire? Why not her or Thomas? Or even Patricia, his loyal wife? She had always believed that her ambition and dedication had earned her a place at the top. But now it seemed like all of that had been in vain. Every success, every sacrifice, every moment she had spent working toward a future she thought was hers was now meaningless. She couldn't accept that someone she barely knew, Someone who had been a stranger for so long was now the sole heir to everything. Weeks passed, and as they dug deeper into Claire's past, they began to uncover things they hadn't expected. The more they learned about her life after her disownment, the more they realized just how much they had misunderstood her. Claire had built a life of her own, far from the Braxtons, far from the wealth and influence that had once been hers by birthright. She had struggled, worked harder than any of them had ever known, and she had done it without the support of her family. The more they uncovered, the more their sense of entitlement began to waver. Claire wasn't the naive girl they had written off years ago. She was a woman who had fought for everything she had, a woman who had suffered her own trials and perhaps, just maybe, she had earned the right to the fortune that had once been theirs. Still, the questions remained. Why had Richard chosen her? What had driven him to make such a monumental decision? And most importantly, why had he kept it a secret for so long? The Braxtons were no closer to answers, but with every passing day, the realization grew. They had underestimated Claire. And now, they were going to have to face her, confront the woman who had been cast aside, but who had, in the end, claimed everything they had once thought was theirs. As the Braxton family sat together, the weight of the moment began to sink in. They had spent weeks searching for Claire, hoping that finding her would provide the answers they so desperately needed. But now, sitting in front of her, they realized that the truth was far more complicated than they could have ever imagined. Claire, once the outcast, the one they had written off, was now the one who held the answers to all their questions. Her life had been built not on wealth or privilege, but on hard work, self-sufficiency, and the resilience to move forward despite the family's rejection. When she spoke, it wasn't with bitterness or anger, but with a quiet strength that both humbled and shocked the Braxtons. "I didn't want the money," Claire said softly, her eyes meeting each of theirs. "I never needed it. I had learned to live without it. What I wanted was to be seen, to be acknowledged for who I really am, not just as an extension of my father's legacy. And in the end, I got that. That's why he gave me everything." The words hit harder than anything the Braxtons had expected. They had spent their lives chasing wealth, believing it was the key to happiness, success, and security. But Claire's calm acceptance of her inheritance, paired with her revelation that she had never needed the wealth to define her, made them question everything. It wasn't about the money at all. It was about forgiveness, reconciliation, and understanding the true value of relationships. The family had been so focused on their individual desires for wealth and power that they had lost sight of what truly mattered, the bonds between them. Sarah, her frustration simmering, looked at Claire, her eyes filled with confusion and self-doubt. "But why? Why us?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why not me? I worked so hard for everything I have. I was loyal. I did everything he asked, and still, you're the one who gets it all." Claire's eyes softened as she replied, "It's not about who worked harder or who was more loyal. Your father gave me everything because he knew, deep down, I had learned to live without it. I didn't need his approval or his wealth to be who I am. He gave me the estate not out of pity or guilt, but because, in the end, he realized I had become someone who could handle it. Someone who had learned what truly mattered." The words were a bitter pill for Sarah to swallow. She had spent years trying to live up to her father's expectations, believing that material success would make her worthy of his love and respect. But here, Claire had built a life of her own, outside of the wealth and power that the family had clung to for so long, and yet she was the one who had been chosen. As the conversation unfolded, the anger in Patricia began to fade, replaced by a deep, unsettling understanding. "I've spent my whole life putting the family first," she said, her voice trembling. "I've supported Richard, raised you all, made sure everything was perfect, and I thought that if I gave him everything, I would be enough. But now, I see that it wasn't the wealth that mattered. It was the love, the connection, the real meaning of family, and I lost sight of that." She looked at Sarah and Thomas, the weight of her own realization sinking in. "We've all been chasing something that doesn't even matter. We've been so focused on money and status that we've forgotten what truly makes us a family. Thomas, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke, his voice quieter now, tinged with guilt. "I've always thought that money would solve everything," he admitted. "It's always been so easy to get what I want, to use the family name to get ahead. But now I see that it's all meaningless. I'm not who I thought I was, and I don't know what to do with that." There was a pause as the family sat together, reflecting on the profound changes in their perspectives. Claire had shown them something they hadn't understood before, that true wealth isn't measured by what you own, but by how you live, how you love, and how you learn to move forward with the people you care about. The inheritance was never about money. It was about the opportunity to heal, to rebuild the connections that had been broken by pride, anger, and a desire for control. Claire had found peace with her past, had built a life based on her own values and work, and in doing so, had unknowingly given the Braxtons the greatest gift of all, the chance to reclaim their humanity, their family, and their sense of purpose beyond wealth. And as the Braxtons looked at one another, the anger and confusion that had once defined their relationship began to fade. They realized that the greatest inheritance they could receive was not the mansion, the cars, or the business, but the chance to rebuild their relationships, to forgive one another, and to embrace the lessons that Claire had taught them. In the end, it was not the money that defined them, but the ability to grow, to forgive, and to move forward as a family. Claire had shown them that true inheritance was found not in material wealth, but in the connections they chose to nurture and the understanding they gained along the way. And so, as they all stood together, the real journey was just beginning, not one of inheritance, but of rebuilding, healing, and finding a new definition of what it meant to be a family. The Braxtons were no longer bound by their father's legacy of wealth. They were bound by something far stronger, their ability to change, to grow, and to finally understand that the greatest treasures are those that can't be bought. As the Braxton family sat together, the weight of the moment began to sink in. They had spent weeks searching for Claire, hoping that finding her would provide the answers they so desperately needed, but now, sitting in front of her, they realized that the truth was far more complicated than they could have ever imagined. Claire, once the outcast, the one they had written off, was now the one who held the answers to all their questions. Her life had been built not on wealth or privilege, but on hard work, self-sufficiency, and the resilience to move forward despite the family's rejection. When she spoke, it wasn't with bitterness or anger, but with a quiet strength that both humbled and shocked the Braxtons. "I didn't want the money," Claire said softly, her eyes meeting each of theirs. "I never needed it. I had learned to live without it. What I wanted was to be seen, to be acknowledged for who I really am, not just as an extension of my father's legacy. And in the end, I got that. That's why he gave me everything." The words hit harder than anything the Braxtons had expected. They had spent their lives chasing wealth, believing it was the key to happiness, success, and security. But Claire's calm acceptance of her inheritance, paired with her revelation that she had never needed the wealth to define her, made them question everything. It wasn't about the money at all, it was about forgiveness, reconciliation, and understanding the true value of relationships. The family had been so focused on their individual desires for wealth and power that they had lost sight of what truly mattered, the bonds between them. Sarah, her frustration simmering, looked at Claire, her eyes filled with confusion and self-doubt. "But why? Why us?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why not me? I worked so hard for everything I have. I was loyal. I did everything he asked, and still, you're the one who gets it all." Claire's eyes softened as she replied, "It's not about who worked harder or who was more loyal. Your father gave me everything because he knew, deep down, I had learned to live without it. I didn't need his approval or his wealth to be who I am. He gave me the estate not out of pity or guilt, but because, in the end, he realized I had become someone who could handle it. Someone who had learned what truly mattered." The words were a bitter pill for Sarah to swallow. She had spent years trying to live up to her father's expectations, believing that material success would make her worthy of his love and respect. But here, Claire had built a life of her own, outside of the wealth and power that the family had clung to for so long, and yet she was the one who had been chosen. As the conversation unfolded, the anger in Patricia began to fade, replaced by a deep, unsettling understanding. "I've spent my whole life putting the family first," she said, her voice trembling. "I've supported Richard, raised you all, made sure everything was perfect, and I thought that if I gave him everything, I would be enough. But now, I see that it wasn't the wealth that mattered. It was the love, the connection, the real meaning of family. And I lost sight of that." She looked at Sarah and Thomas, the weight of her own realization sinking in. We've all been chasing something that doesn't even matter. We've been so focused on money and status that we've forgotten what truly makes us a family. Thomas, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke, his voice quieter now, tinged with guilt. "I've always thought that money would solve everything," he admitted. "It's always been so easy to get what I want, to use the family name to get ahead. But now, I see that it's all meaningless. I'm not who I thought I was, and I don't know what to do with that." There was a pause as the family sat together, reflecting on the profound changes in their perspectives. Claire had shown them something they hadn't understood before, that true wealth isn't measured by what you own, but by how you live, how you love, and how you learn to move forward with the people you care about. The inheritance was never about money. It was about the opportunity to heal, to rebuild the connections that had been broken by pride, anger, and a desire for control. Claire had found peace with her past, had built a life based on her own values and work, and in doing so, had unknowingly given the Braxtons the greatest gift of all, the chance to reclaim their humanity, their family, and their sense of purpose beyond wealth. And as the Braxtons looked at one another, the anger and confusion that had once defined their relationship began to fade. They realized that the greatest inheritance they could receive was not the mansion, the cars, or the business, but the chance to rebuild their relationships, to forgive one another, and to embrace the lessons that Claire had taught them. In the end, it was not the money that defined them, but the ability to grow, to forgive, and to move forward as a family. Claire had shown them that true inheritance was found not in material wealth, but in the connections they chose to nurture and the understanding they gained along the way. And so, as they all stood together, the real journey was just beginning, not one of inheritance, but of rebuilding, healing, and finding a new definition of what it meant to be a family. The Braxtons were no longer bound by their father's legacy of wealth. They were bound by something far stronger, their ability to change, to grow, and to finally understand that the greatest treasures are those that can't be bought.